with the Establishment Clause. You see, there are two religion clauses in the First Amendment. There's the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause, and there's always a tension between these clauses. And I think the two cases from today illustrates that tension. So let me try to illustrate what that tension is. Let's say that a government, a city or a state, goes ahead and provides funding for a religious school. Okay, well, that act might violate the Establishment Clause that might establish a religion. Okay. Let's say a government denies funding to a school on the basis of their religion. Well, that same act might violate the Free Exercise Clause, like in Espinoza and Trinity Lutheran. So how do you reconcile these tensions, right? How do you have one part of the Constitution saying that government can't fund religion, and another part of the Constitution saying the government can't deny funding because of religion, right? And this is this tension that's been around for a very long time. The Supreme Court has tried to address this tension in the past in a case called Locke against Davey. L-O-C-K-E, Locke against Davey. And Locke v. Davey suggested that there's what they call play in the joints, right? What that means is the government has some flexibility to work with the free exercise of religion and the Establishment Clause to try to balance the two. As you might imagine, that is a very difficult balance to strike. And for the longest time, the Supreme Court sort of favored the Establishment Clause side. So during the Warren Court and for part of the Berger Court, the court would be very hesitant to allow any funding of religion. And then starting in the 1980s and 1990s, the pendulum started going back the other way, where the court started having more concern for the free exercise portion. Our readings for today settle the issue pretty damn well. I think Justice Breyer makes this point in his dissent. Trinity Lutheran and the follow-up case of Espinoza signal very clearly that the court is not concerned about the Establishment Clause anymore. That if there's a tension between funding schools and denying schools funding, the government should err on the side of funding the schools rather than worrying about the Establishment Clause. Okay? And that balance extends even where there's a state constitutional provision that bars funding for religious schools. Lurking in the background is whether these state Blaine Amendments themselves are unconstitutional. In fact, I think in Espinoza, the court ducked that issue. That was squarely presented. The plaintiffs argue that the state constitution was unconstitutional. Josh, how can a state constitution be unconstitutional? Easy. It's like any other state law, right? In fact, the Supremacy Clause even is a state constitution. If a state constitution denies funding the basis of religious status, that state constitution would seem to run afoul of Trinity Lutheran. So I think we're not quite done with this topic. I think the court will come back to the Blaine Amendment issues at least once or twice more. So you're sort of in a transition period, but Espinoza, I think, settled the issue pretty directly of how the court will strike that balance. All right, any questions before we get started? All right. Who's next up on the list? I don't know where I am. I don't remember. Who's next?
I think I went last.
Is Alexandria Laura? Okay, I can find who's next. After you is Calvin. Calvin, you here?
Yes, sir, right here.
Okay, thanks, Calvin. Do you want to give me the facts, please, in our first case, Trinity Lutheran?
So Trinity Lutheran Church also ran this preschool, and they had a play area outside, which was covered in gravel. And they applied for a state grant to get the gravel replaced with soft rubber.
Yeah, you've seen this at playgrounds. Basically, take old tires and they recycle them. They chop up the tires, make these little rubber chips. That way, if you fall and you hit your knee, you don't like scrape yourself. kids, but when I was a kid, we had cement on the floor. We'd asphalt. We didn't have rubber chips, but that's what we have today. All right, so Calvin, go on.
So the state denied them this grant. There was a Missouri statute that said that they couldn't give any money directly or indirectly to established religions per their state laws and constitution. So the church sued the state, said that violated their First Amendment rights of free speech and free exercise of religion through the 14th Amendment.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Calvin. All right. So this was a tricky case, and the facts are messy because the state stopped defending its decision. Initially, Trinity Lutheran was a church that ran a daycare. They applied for a state grant that would provide funding for these rubber chips, these rubber tire, these safety scraps. The school actually ranked pretty highly. The state ranks people of how well their applications are submitted. They ranked in the top 10% of the applications submitted. So they probably would have gotten it. But they were denied the funding on the basis of the fact they were a church. Had this been a private school, maybe just a military academy or any other private school, they would have been given this grant without any issue. But they were denied on the basis of the fact they were religious. Now, Missouri initially defended the decision based on the fact that their state law, which is basically called the Blaine Amendment, prohibits direct funding of religious schools. As the case went on appeal, Missouri had a new attorney general. You might know his name was Josh Hawley, who's now a U.S. senator. And Attorney General Hawley declined to defend this policy. He argued that the school should get the funding. So this is another case where it isn't clear there was still a live case. It always seems, doesn't this always happen, right? Where there's a contentious issue, and then by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, it's not clear it's actually a live case anymore. I think of Windsor, the Defensive Marriage Act case. Yet the court proceeded to resolve the dispute. There was a fractured opinion, if you noticed. It says at the very beginning that the Chief Justice delivers the opinion of the court except for footnote 3. All right, except for footnote 3. And this will prove to be very important. So on one level, this case is unanimous. Well, not quite unanimous, but 7-2. But it breaks down very quickly beyond those beyond that issue. So let's walk through the votes. Madison, you here?
Yes.
Okay, walk me through the chief's opinion, the majority opinion, please.
Okay. The majority opinion decided that that they concluded that the exclusion of this was just because it's a church is not in line with the Constitution, and they said that that the past case history made clear that imposing a special condition on the free exercise of religion was under the most strict scrutiny. So that's what they looked at here.
Good.
And they ultimately decided that saying that they were excluded solely because they're a church and making them decide they would have to either give up their religious status or keep it and not be able to participate was creating, I think they said, like an extra disability.
Good.
Or
okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Madison. Very good. So we have a Roberts opinion, and if you're sensing a pattern, whenever there's a Roberts opinion, it always seems so simple because he's such a good writer, but he always papers over some very serious disagreements. There just as glosses over them, and this is just typical Roberts opinion. He explains that the case law in this area is very simple. It's not. And he summarizes all the case law in like a single sentence. And he says, look, the policy is if the government is denying some benefits to a religious group based on religious status, that policy is then reviewed with strict scrutiny. He cites Lukumi. Now, I mean, go read Lukumi. The words he cites are there, but this is a reformulation of the case law. It's a reformulation of the case law, right? This is absolutely shifting it, right? There's no balancing, right? There's no determination of animus. There's no determination if there's some sort of improper purpose behind the move. So long as there's some sort of disability imposed based on religious status, the decision is reviewed with strict scrutiny. And as you know all too well, once the court says you're reviewing the decision with strict scrutiny, the government's going to lose. That's just the rule. That's how it goes, right? So this is a very favorable test to houses of worship. It allows the imposition of liability strictly based on denying it on the basis of the identity or the status. Okay. Yeah, Blake, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
So I've had this question after reading both of these cases, and I think I get it more from Lukumi. When you look at laws of general applicability, in this particular instance, they didn't target a specific religion or anything like that. They targeted churches generally. So, and I mean, I have personal mixed feelings about which way these cases went because I see legitimate arguments on both sides. But what happened to the general applicability issue? Is that what Lukumi is deciding or what Roberts is addressing?
Right. So I think, Blake, I get your question. It's a really good question. I think you framed it in a careful way. Let me try to answer your question as best as I can. Smith and Lukumi, right, were about inflicting some forms of punishment or regulation on religious groups, right? You say you can't get these unemployment benefits, you can't perform your sacrifices, right? That's category number one of cases. This is a second category of cases where the state's offering certain benefits to the general public and is withholding those benefits on the basis of religious status. Now, I'm going to destroy what I just said in a second, but see the difference between imposing punishment versus offering benefits, right? Now, I'm going to just destroy what I just said. What's the difference between imposing a disability and withholding a benefit? They're the same thing, right? If you sort of look at it the other way, the decision to not give these tire scraps was itself a form of punishment. So it does sort of blend in with the Lukumi-Smith line of cases. There's not like a, if you will, a wall between the Smith-Lukumi line of cases and the Espinoza Trinity line of cases. They're very similar, but the way the chief frames it, he's such a good writer, says you cannot deny any benefit or impose a special disability on the basis of religious status. That doesn't intersect with Smith exactly. But you're right. The law in this case looks a hell of a lot like a law of general applicability. It's neutral. It doesn't target anyone. It simply applies across the board. And for the longest time, states said that their Blaine Amendment were good under Smith. And that's how they defended them and say, look, we're complying with Smith. We're neutral. We're not favoring any sect. We're completely neutral. Does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah. It's messy, right? Yeah. Krista, go ahead.
Okay, so then I guess off of that, is it really a law of general applicability when it singles out just one status to not get something?
Religious.
Yeah, so to me, general applicability means across the board, whereas this was across the board except for, which then it's not really generally applicable.
Right. So now we're going back to what does generally applicable mean, right? Does generally applicable mean applies to all religions equally or applies to everyone without regard to religion, right? The Lukumi-Smith test seems to be, is it targeting any one religion or is it applying to all religions equally, right? The Trinity cases, it's not picking Lutherans or Mormons or Catholics. It's just saying church, right? Any sort of religion. And that's why I think Roberts is saying this is imposing disability and religious status. I would encourage you, to the extent that you can, to not think about Smith here, because the court doesn't, right? I'm just going to do a Control F. I mean, Smith is barely cited in this case, right? I mean, just a couple citations that are pretty not relevant. So this is different, right? This is different than Smith. We're going to another case in class on Wednesday that's going to muck up the waters even more. It's the Lady of Guadalupe. It's called the ministerial exception. It's whether certain employees of churches are exempt from discrimination laws. And that creates even more tension with Smith because we're having a discrimination ordinance, right? So maybe hang on to your question with Smith till Wednesday, but it's going to get even more mucky.
All right, thank you.
The other short answer is the court doesn't really like Smith anymore. I don't think they had the votes to overrule it with Kennedy on the court. This was his last term, or maybe second to last term. But this was the best they could do with Kennedy still on the court. Also, keep in mind, the vote in this case was very messy, right? So you had 7 justices rule in favor of the church. You had Ginsburg and Sotomayor dissent, right? But then you had Justice Gorsuch and Justice Thomas basically concurring judgment, saying we don't agree with this analysis. So that's problematic. You had Justice Breyer concur in the judgment because he didn't agree with the analysis. And then you only had 4 of the conservatives plus Justice Kagan make a majority. But there are only 4 justices who agree with footnote 3. So it was very, very fragmented. And they had to make a lot of compromises to make this opinion work. All right, so any other questions? The Roberts opinion is very easy to state, right? It's very simple to state. 1 second. The Roberts opinion is very simple to state. Discrimination on the basis of religious status is going to be almost always unconstitutional. So we review with strict scrutiny, and that's a killjoy. Yeah, Victoria, go ahead.
I have it might be a sticky question, but one of the things that my brain keeps coming back to with these cases is that like most churches are tax exempt, so they do have differential treatment than other organizations and public schools and whatnot. Where does it come in that like differential treatment is not fair whenever it comes to grants?
Right. So it's a very good question you're asking, right? So in most jurisdictions, there are tax exemptions for nonprofits, both in terms of sales tax and property tax. So there was a wide range of exemptions. States have these prohibitions saying that you can't give funding for a church. Tori, let me ask you a question. Is a state giving a tax exemption the same as a state giving funding? And answer very carefully because it's a hard question.
That is a very tricky question.
It's
not direct funding.
Direct. You said the magic word. Direct. That's the word. So the withholding of a tax burden is viewed differently than providing affirmative funding. I think that's the short answer. You see that?
I do. Thank you.
Yeah, but you hit the right word without me having to budget, so it's a good job. I was going to have to pry it out of you, but you got it right away, right? Now, if a city decides to withhold a tax exemption from a church, then it would be truly neutral. They'd be applying the same rules they apply to a church as to a candy store or whatever else. Trust me, there are some people who have argued, not some people, a lot of people have argued that the tax exemption for churches is itself an establishment clause violation that's giving a benefit on the basis of religion. Those arguments haven't gone very far, but those arguments have been made for forever. All right, let's move on to the other opinions. So we have the majority, right? The Roberts opinion, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? Justice Thomas concurs, as he always does, say, yeah, I would reconsider this old precedent, Locke versus Davey, which, I don't think the courts overruled Locke v. Davey, but it doesn't have much juice anymore after Espinoza. So I think Thomas basically got what he wanted. He usually does. He's usually about 4 or 5 years ahead of everyone else. And so you read the Thomas stuff carefully from 2017, he gets it in 2020. That's usually how it goes. Justice Gorsuch focuses on this footnote 3, right? And let me just read footnote 3. This case involves express discrimination based on religious identity. We do not discuss religious uses of funding. So Roberts draws this distinction between religious identity and religious uses. And you can be damn well sure Elena Kagan helped that footnote because she was in the majority, right? Roberts did not have 5 votes for an opinion. By adding that footnote, I think he lost Thomas and Gorsuch, which says a lot. He could have had a 5-vote majority without the footnote, but he added the footnote to get Kagan with a 4-member majority. That's just classic Roberts. That's what he does. All right. Where am I up to? Mackenzie, are you next?
Yes.
All right, Mackenzie, help me out. Footnote 3. What's the difference between religious use, religious identity and religious use? Help me out here.
So I think basically identity would be not giving money to a group because they're part of a religious organization. And then the use would be not giving it because of how the money is going to be used. So I think like in the Locke case was kind of an example of that, where they upheld the restriction because it was a restriction on how the money was going to be used, which went to a religious purpose rather than the identity of the recipient.
Okay. So let me ask the hard follow-up question, right? Why did this church build a playground?
I'm assuming just to help the children from being injured.
Okay. Why does a church have a daycare?
Well,
You see where I'm going with this?
yeah, it's a good question because that's one thing that, Sotomayor and Ginsburg come up in their dissent. They talk about how the church, they're trying, I don't want to use the word infiltrate, but like...
Attract.
Yeah, they're trying to
Infiltrate.
instill some of those religious beliefs into the children as well as providing care for them.
Yeah, so maybe they have mixed motives, right? Maybe they want to help kids, but also they want their kids to have religious upbringing. So is there any religious school that will ever not have any sort of religious uses? Is that even possible?
Probably not.
Isn't the definition of religious school they're going to do religious things, pray and worship the God and other stuff?
I would assume so, just from experience.
Yeah. So Mackenzie, I'll ask you the question that Gorsuch asked: can you really draw a line between religious status and religious use? Does this line really exist?
I don't think so. I think it'd be nearly impossible to
Yeah.
try to do that.
And this is Roberts, right? He gives you a resounding victory, but has this footnote that screws everything up, right? That undermines everything he writes in his opinion. This is just like if you can describe John Roberts in a footnote, it's this one. This is it. Thank you, Mackenzie. Yeah, look, I know why this footnote was added. It was added to bring Kagan along, but bringing this footnote lost Gorsuch and Alito, which is fine for the chief. But Roberts is still trying to separate the Reynolds line. Remember the polygamy case, right? Where religious action versus religious thought, right? Belief versus conduct. Roberts is trying to maintain that line, but it was never a very good line to begin with, right? Because a person who exercises faith does so because of his identity. and a person who identifies as a person of faith exercises through faith. They're two sides of the same coin, and it's going to be very hard to disentangle them. Perhaps in this case, it was, I think, pretty easy because, we're talking about tire scraps, right? We're not talking about prayer, but if you think Sotomayor makes this point in her dissent, I think, quite well. The school has these playgrounds not just to be nice stewards of children, but to give children a Christian upbringing. That's why the school exists, right? Religious schools aren't there to just teach kids readings, writing, arithmetic. They're there to teach kids religious upbringing, along with some other subjects. So Gorsuch and Thomas Fracture often deny the Roberts a majority, right? He tried to get it, but he lost him, and he didn't want to lose Kagan. If he had dropped footnote 3, he probably could have had a majority, but he didn't want to. And this was before Kavanaugh joined the court. This whole Kennedy, so it's still a bit in flux. There was one term where both Gorsuch and Kennedy were on the court, and they didn't agree very much, even though Gorsuch clerked for Kennedy. So whatever that's worth. All right. Any questions of the majority or the Gorsuch or Thomas concurrences? All right. You have Justice Breyer concur, and he's he's a bit of an idiosyncratic person in the free exercise clause. You'll see he's not a doctrinal liberal on this issue. He kind of has his own path on this, and he says, it's obvious that you can't cut off general services. Imagine the government says, you know what? If you're a church, you can't dial 911. You have to have your own private security force, right? Your own fire department, right? That wouldn't work. Here, it's about helping children be safe. He says, let's talk about other benefits another day. So Breyer's like, please don't do this now. Sotomayor and Ginsburg, though, vigorously disagree with this holding. And I think she makes points that are accurate. She says the court profoundly changes the court's case law. I think they did. To say the court has to provide public funding directly to a church. Now, that's not exactly the court held, but that's the effect of it, right? If the state decides, hold on, who's next? Erica, you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Erica, if Missouri didn't want to provide funding for a church, what could Missouri simply do? They're not required to provide funding to a church. What could they do?
Like you brought up to Tori about tax exemptions or any other kind of benefit that indirectly funds the church.
Well, if the church is required to, if the state can't deny funding to the church, and the state doesn't want to give funding to the church, what could the state simply do? What's the easiest way out of this problem?
If they don't want to deny funding to the church?
Yeah, what could they do?
Provide funding.
How could the state avoid discriminating against just the church? What could the state do?
Against just the church, I guess.
What could they do? Is the state required to fund tire scraps?
No.
So what could the state do?
They can provide tire scraps to anybody that applies for it.
But that was here, right? That would still be funding a church.
Yeah, but they only provided scraps to about, I think, 14 applicants, didn't it say? They could just provide to everybody.
But then they'd be giving to churches as well. What could they do if they don't want to fund churches?
Just cut off
everything. They have to cut. Yes, that's right. They would have to have zero funding to anyone, right? Do you think that'd be palatable? Would that be feasible? To give no funding to any group for anything?
I guess it could be, but it would probably
good. Yeah.
It would probably take away from people ending it.
Right. So all the children. So instead of having just some scraped knees, you have a lot of scraped knees, as Roberts would say. Right. So it's simply not feasible. He's a good writer. I hate on him, but he writes well. But it's simply not feasible to have the state withdraw all manner of funding from everyone. So long as churches can apply under the majority, they can't be denied funding. And that's what Sotomayor says. Like, now they have no choice. Their choices are either don't give anyone funding for anything, which is insane, or you have to give it to the religious groups. And I think Sotomayor is right that this is a change in the doctrine. You can tell she's kind of annoyed, right? It's like, this is not what the law was. And I think she's right about that. Because historically, states had this play in the joints to sort of mediate between the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. All right. Questions on Espinoza? I'm sorry, on the first case, Trinity Lutheran. Already jumping ahead in my head. This was a really important case. Espinoza was basically a follow-up. Right? Once Trinity Lutheran was decided, there was no way Espinoza was going the other way. This was sort of set. Any questions on Trinity Lutheran? Okay. Edward, are you here? Edward.
Yes,
Okay, Eddie, do you want to give me the facts, please, in our second case, Espinoza? And the facts here are a little bit messy, so I may help you along the way because it's a really messy case.
It is. It's
Yeah.
two separate scholarship funds, correct?
Well, you start. I'll finish.
Okay. So basically, what I got from this is that individual families could donate to this Big Sky Scholarship program, and then if you donate to that program, you receive a scholarship for a benefit, a tax credit of up to $150 to go towards a student expenses. And so this family donated to the fund. They got the tax benefit, and then they tried to use it towards a private school. And then Montana said that they can't use it because the school that they were trying to use it at was a religious school.
All right, no, that was actually pretty good. So let me try and see if I can explain this. This is another case where it wasn't clear to me that there was a live controversy from the time this case went to the court, because what the lower court did was very, very strange, very, very unusual. So Montana has what's called a Blaine Amendment, very similar to the one in Missouri, which says that the state cannot provide any sort of direct funding. This is Tory's word, right? Direct funding to religious schools and houses of worship. Right, and I think 20-something states have these on their books. There are a lot of states that have these in various forms. These amendments don't have a very pleasant pedigree. They're called Blaine Amendments after a member of Congress named James Blaine of Maine. Blaine of Maine. And they were enacted for a largely not good purpose. In the 1800s, most of the private schools were Catholic. And these were laws that were largely enacted to try and shut down Catholic schools because they didn't like Catholics. Now, Montana's was in a slightly different story because it was enacted in the 1970s. And it isn't clear that that same sort of Catholic animus existed in the 1970s. In fact, there was evidence in the record showing that members of various churches favored the Blaine Amendment in the 1970s. Huh? Yeah, we've come a long way. Things are different than they were 30 years ago. Who's next on the list? That was Eddie. Francisco, you here?
Yes.
This is a hard question. Let's see how you do with it. Sorry, it's true. Why might churches favor the Blaine Amendment? Sotomayor gets at this in her dissent a little bit. But why might churches favor the Blaine Amendment? What's the risk of having government funding? Why would a church not want funding from the state?
They might end up having to fund other religions that they don't agree with.
Well, that's possible. But let's just say you're just one church. You're a small church in Montana. Why would you not want to have the state giving you money? Can you just decline to apply?
That might come in with that money.
I'm sorry?
There might be some government control that comes along with that money.
Ooh, you're on the right track. What do you mean?
I guess if they start offering benefits, they might have, qualifications, things that churches have to follow that they don't want to have to.
And what do we know when the federal government offers you money? Is it always easy to say no to it?
Generally, no.
But Francisco, couldn't you just not accept it? Just say, I don't want it in the first place? Isn't that possible?
Yes.
So then what's the problem? just says, all right, whatever. You give the money to church A, church B, I'm going to decline it. William, you here? William M.
Yes, sir.
What's the risk for churches to why can't a church just decline to accept money? Maybe church 1 wants it and church 2 doesn't. What's the problem here?
Maybe it's under inclusive or like an overreach of government power. Maybe the government will like let the power go to their heads.
What do you mean go to their heads? I think you're on the right track.
Like, okay, so church 1 does it, so we can force church 2 to do it.
What do you mean force?
Oh, not force, but I guess compel. I'm struggling for the right words.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this. All right, let me help out a bit so we can move the class along. I think Sotomayor makes his point in his dissent quite well. There's a long history here of state getting involved with religion. And one of the reasons why the separation of church and state is not just to make atheists happy, it's in some regard to protect religion itself. In the history of the world, when the church and the state get connected, things sometimes get ugly. And the state start using the church to advance certain goals that are not proper. And the churches sometimes use the government power to perhaps deviate from teaching of religion. So the churches said the only way for us to keep our faith to ourselves is to keep the government out of our hair. And these Blaine Amendments are keeping government out of our hair, right? We don't have to deal with them. They don't have to deal with us. Now, that was the position of some churches in the 1970s. Today, I think the majority, I shouldn't say majority, but a large share of churches don't like these amendments anymore because they want the money, right? They want the funding, and they don't like the fact that their public school, that their private schools, which are being depleted by lack of resources, can't get funding. So there are two very different positions. All right. So let me try to summarize the facts. I think Eddie did a good job with it. The Montana legislature authorized this tax credit scholarship program where families can get tax credits for going to private schools, including religious schools. The state constitution says, no, you can't provide direct funding. The legislature thought this was indirect, right? This is not direct funding. The state court, the Montana State Supreme Court, said, no, this is direct funding. Therefore, we kill the entire program, right? There's no funding for religious schools. There's no funding for secular schools. Like, no one gets funding. It's like the tire scrap example I gave you before, right? To Erica, no one gets the funding. No one gets the money. So at this point, is there actually even a case, right? The state court leveled down. No one gets the funding. Therefore, how can the religious school complain, right? They're getting treated the exact same way that a non-religious school is. $0 being given and they're getting $0. What's the injury? So again, I am not convinced there was actually a real case for the Supreme Court. This, all these really important cases always get sort of drawn up in these sort of procedural difficulties. It's very common. Roberts sort of just does what he does always, so just brushes it aside. Said, well, the state Supreme Court mentioned the free exercise clause, and they were wrong about that. Therefore, the decision to strike down the entire program was wrong. Therefore, the case is live. I think Ginsburg makes a good argument with Kagan that this is not even a real case anymore. But what are you going to do? All right, so let's go on to the merits. Ashley, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Ashley. Why does the chief and the majority find that this policy is unconstitutional?
So basically, he looked at, like you mentioned, the free exercise clause, and wanted to focus on the free exercise clause, kind of like extending in a way Trinity Lutheran's analysis.
Yeah.
And so he was focusing on answering whether the application of the no aid provision violated the free exercise clause. So I guess trying to avoid the entanglement issues, but and then quoted Trinity Lutheran saying disqualifying otherwise eligible recipients from a public benefit solely because of the religious character imposes a penalty on the free exercise of religion that triggers the most exacting scrutiny. So it seemed like it just was applying the same standard from Trinity Lutheran.
Yeah, 100%. Good job, Ashley. Espinoza is basically follow up with Trinity Lutheran. In fact, Randy and I debated we even add Espinoza to the book, and it doesn't add too much, but I think we have to for sake of completeness. So this will be in the next edition of our book. This is religious discrimination on the basis of religious status. If you were a private secular school, you got the money, get the tax credits. If you're a private religious school, you didn't. This is straight up religious status discrimination from Trinity Lutheran. The court didn't resolve the even harder issue. If the courts, okay, so in other words, the Montana Supreme Court said you can't give funding to the schools based on the religious status. So what the court said is the actions of the Montana Supreme Court violated the free exercise clause. Okay? But why did the Montana Supreme Court did what they did? They were following the state constitution. Wouldn't the natural conclusion be that the state constitution violates the establishment clause, violates the free exercise clause, right? That the Blaine Amendment violates the free exercise clause. Roberts did not touch that issue. He did not want to go there because had he done that, he would have suggested that the Blaine Amendments in 20-something states are unconstitutional. So again, Roberts sort of just didn't really decide the actual issue, sort of decide like a peripheral issue that was present. So the upshot is the actions of the Montana Supreme Court are unconstitutional. The tax credit program is restored, but you still have this Blaine Amendment on the books that is probably unconstitutional. So there's going to be another case to decide whether the Blaine Amendment itself is constitutional. So the court punted on this issue. We'll probably get another case in the near future. All right. Any questions on the majority by Chief Justice Roberts? Any questions on the majority by the Chief? All right. We have a lot of separate writings here for you. Thomas, again, concurs saying we need to revisit all the Establishment Clause cases. That's what he usually does. I think he might win on this one. I think it's going to happen very, very soon. Justice Alito also concurs. He's a little bitter here. He's not happy that the court didn't focus on the fact that these amendments have a very anti-Catholic history. This is something that's very, very, very important to him. You can tell this is bothering him because he wrote a lot about it. In fact, the excerpt I gave you is pretty short. I cut a lot of it out. But Alito was very upset by this. Justice Gorsuch comes back and says that this footnote 3 distinction between status and status and use doesn't really hold. Right? Think about it. What is this money being used for? Christian books? I don't know. Hiring teachers to have Christian instruction? Right? This money will be used for religious exercises. Right? There's no evidence that they segregate their funds only buy biology textbooks or math books, whatever. It's going to the school and they can do whatever they want with it. So there's really no way of distinguishing between religious status and use. And Gorsuch says that even trying to draw this distinction doesn't work. He says the right to be religious without the right to do religious things is hardly a right at all. So he says the distinction doesn't hold. All right, questions? Questions in the Gorsuch concurrence? Yeah, go ahead, Krista.
Okay, so when I think about this, these are scholarships. The scholarships were awarded to the students, not the schools, right? And then the students decided what school they wanted to use them at?
More or less, yeah, that's about right.
But the state basically told the parents, well, you can't use them anywhere you want. We're going to dictate where you can.
Well, the state court said that. The state court, well, to be precise, the state legislature said you can use them wherever you want, and the state court said no one gets any tax credits. So, not exactly that last part, which he says right. The state never told them where they could use it. The state said you can use it whatever you want, and the state court said, well, because this violates our state constitution, you can't use them anywhere. No tax credits are allowed. So that was the posture here, which is very weird.
All right, I understand that. Okay.
All right, Gavin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I understand Gorsuch's mindset whenever talking about how use and identity are kind of the same thing, but it brings me back. It makes me think of Reynolds and how one of the main first distinctions in freedom of religion was the difference between action and belief.
Yeah.
So is he kind of saying that he doesn't believe in that?
Isn't it crazy? Everything comes back to Reynolds. Isn't it crazy? Remember? Is it, you're like, why are you spending so much time in the 1800s case, Josh? Why aren't you talking about the other one? It's still the rule, right? It's in a very short issue between belief and action, between status and use, right? If the free exercise clause is limited to just belief, then Gorsuch is wrong. I think what Gorsuch is saying is you can't disentangle the two. That it's not a neat distinction. Yeah, thanks, Gavin. Any other questions on the concurrence from Gorsuch? All right, you have a concurrence from Ginsburg, and she basically says that there's no discrimination here. The upshot of the Supreme Court decision of the state is that no one gets the money, right? This is called leveling down, right? When you have discrimination, there's two ways of addressing it: leveling up or leveling down. Leveling up would mean everyone gets the credits, and leveling down means no one gets the credits. And here the state court said no one gets the credits. And you can't claim discrimination if no one is getting these benefits. I think Ginsburg is probably right. There's no longer a live case. I feel very uneasy about this decision, but what do I know? Then we have Justice Breyer, who is not happy. He's very upset. When he dissents alone, he's very upset. He argues that under Locke v. Davey, this is fine. That there should be play in the joints between what the Establishment Clause permits and what the Free Exercise Clause compels. What Breyer is basically saying is the Davey case is gone. Right? There's no longer a play in the joints, that now there's a clear favorite, which is the free exercise of religion. All right. Sotomayor wrote the final dissent. This was solo. She was joined by Kagan in part, which is sort of weird. The part Kagan joined never made much sense, but it was joined by Kagan in part. And Sotomayor says the government must have some room to recognize the status of religion. And that this sort of bright line test, which is easy to apply, forces states to fund religion even if they don't want to. And this sort of solidifies the court's approach to free exercise clause jurisprudence. It just the church is going to be winning these cases, not the state. All right. Questions on Espinoza. Very important case. This is probably the most important free exercise case in a decade, maybe more. Chris, go ahead.
You can tell I liked this topic. On this one, what ran through my head, this is a public welfare legislation. If you allowed these to stand, what would keep the government from coming back and limiting how an individual receives actual welfare and saying, well, you've got a welfare check, but you can only use it for these items and you can't use it to tithe, or we're going to give you unemployment and you've qualified for the employment, here's the money, but you can only use it this way and not this way because we don't want you funding religion. I mean, these are all coming from that same pot of money.
Yeah, I think that'd be hard to justify because once a person has money in their hands, it's hard to tell them how to spend it. I think that would be a free exercise clause violation. You're telling someone they can't spend money on their house of worship, even though they got it from the state. I don't think that would fly.
But these are scholarships coming from that same, well, I guess this was a scholarship program that people directly contributed to. It wasn't out of tax dollars, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that would be the difference.
Or maybe I'll give you a better example. Let's say the state starts taxing donations to houses of worship. In other words, they eliminate the tax-exempt status of houses of worship, and they start taxing those contributions. But that violates the free exercise clause. Because if I contribute to Planned Parenthood or the NRA, I get a tax deduction. But if I contribute to a church, I don't. So it's basically punishing those who contribute to a church. Would that be a violation of the free exercise clause? Time is up.
Well, they could argue it's an act of paying money, right?
Not a belief,
And
it's
the
an act.
church's argument would be it's belief that the Bible says I should tithe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be hard.
All right, the minute poll's running. Let me just wrap up briefly. The current law is actually pretty simple. If there's discrimination on religious status, the government loses. There are going to be some harder cases where the status and use lines blur. We haven't hit that yet. But at least in the current law, things are clean for at least the first time in decades. All right? All right, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful day. If you have any questions, I'll office hours in about 25 minutes or so. Otherwise, I'll see you all on Wednesday. Thank you very much.